Hello, everybody. This is Cryptids and Critters Paranormal. I'm your host, the Dooster. The pollen count's kind of high today, which makes my throat kind of raw and scratchy. So if y'all will, kind of bear with me, and I'll try my best to get through this. It's a little bit lengthy. It's not too bad. This story I'm going to relate to you occurred in 1863 during what a lot of people refer to as the Civil War. I disagree with that term for the simple fact it was not a civil war, though people like to call it that. A civil war is fought within the confines of a country. The Confederate States of America had already seceded from the United States and had formed their own individual country. So the attack was from the north. Some people call it the War of Northern Aggression. Some call it the war between the states, and some incorrectly call it the Civil War. This story is featured in my book, A Ridge Too Far, the saga of Colonel Cyrus Sugg. It's available on Amazon. It's also, I have it here at the house. If you want a copy, want an autographed copy, send me an email to ghosthunter911@gmail.com. That's ghosthunter911@gmail.com. And I will make sure you get a signed autographed copy of this book shipped to you. I call this story The Great Train Crash of 1863. This is a little-known story that occurred during the war. Excuse me. The small community of Stegall Station, Georgia, was situated about 35 miles northwest of Atlanta along the Western and Atlantic Railroad. A single boxcar depot and a wood stop along the lifeline of the Confederacy, Stegall Station saw heavy rail traffic between Atlanta and Chattanooga, and many of the state-owned engines utilized during the war traveled this tracks through Stegall Station. The name was later changed to Emerson, and with the exception of the Great Locomotive Chase on April 12, 1862, nothing exciting ever happened in this quiet little village. All that changed some 18 months later on September 13th, 1863. After the Battle of Vicksburg, which ended on July 4th, 1863, the 50th Tennessee Infantry Regiment remained in Mississippi until early September of that year, when they were ordered north to Georgia by rail for the purpose of reinforcing General Braxton Bragg. They marched to Enterprise, Mississippi, and boarded a northbound train for Atlanta. They arrived in Atlanta on September 11th and set up camp, pulling guard duty while they waited for their orders. On the evening of the 12th, they got their orders to proceed north the next day and broke camp. They proceeded to the depot to load their supplies in the boxcars, and they slept in the boxcars that night. On Sunday morning, September 13th, engine number 41, also known as the Senator, was piloted by Mr. Schofield. It pulled out of Atlanta with the 50th Tennessee Infantry, the 1st Tennessee Battalion, and the 10th Tennessee Infantry Regiment on board. There was a touch of autumn in the air. The sun was shining bright, and the first few miles passed by without incident. All that was about to change. Now, during the final years of the war, rail lines were in poor repair due to wear, negligence, and very little maintenance, and it's partially to blame for what transpired next. Some 18 or 20 miles out of Atlanta, one of the boxcars ran off the track and broke down. And inexperienced in the labor-intensive task of re-railing the truck wheels, the soldiers on board a disabled train finally succeeded in getting the car back on track, a process which consumed the biggest part of the day. Now, once back on track, Engineer Schofield piloted the Senator to the sidetrack at Ackworth, where he waited until dark in case any southbound trains were backed up and needed to pass. Keep in mind this is a single railroad track. Oddly, there was no traffic during the delay, and already out of scheduled time, Schofield pulled out onto the main track and continued his northward journey with a full head of steam. Meanwhile, engine number 42, also known as the Chieftain, was piloted by Mr. Howden. It was southbound for Atlanta, evacuating sick and wounded soldiers of Bragg's army from the northern battlefields. The Chieftain was a special, non-scheduled train, pulling about 15 boxcars, most of which were empty. Howden stopped the train at Adairsville and sent a telegraph to the depot in Marietta, inquiring if a track was clear for him to continue south. The agent at Marietta, unaware of the morning train running off the track, simply replied, "All clear." You can see where I'm going with this. With that, engine 42 headed south with a full head of steam. Keep in mind that both the Senator and the Chieftain were peacetime locomotives that were quickly pressed into military service. Neither engine was equipped for nighttime running and should not have been in service after dark. Lacking kerosene headlamps and traveling blind on a moonless night, the two locomotives were on a deadly collision course that could have been avoided. Both trains were running at maximum speed, which would have been about 18 to 20 miles per hour for steam-powered engines during that time period. The narrow-gauge railroad bed, spikes, rails, and rotting cross ties would not support fast speeds, and when combined with the danger of running in total darkness, it led to a needless tragedy and a terrible loss of life near Big Shanty. Originally known as Big Shanty Hill, the hill was too steep for a locomotive to climb and had to be cut down to decrease the angle of the incline. Due to the massive excavation required to cut into the hill, numerous shanty shacks had been constructed to house the railroad workers that were assigned to the project, and that's where the name of Big Shanty came from. Sometime between 9 o'clock and midnight, depending on whose account you read, the two trains collided head-on near Big Shanty, Georgia. Both trains met in a curve in the deep cut, going at full speed, which would have been about 18 to 20 miles per hour for steam-powered steam engines during that time. The crash was so horrific, it awoke the local residents, who rushed to the site. They found bodies strewn along the tracks. Most of them were badly injured, and several were dead. Both engines were lying on their sides and were badly damaged. The residents were overwhelmed with rescue duties, trying to respond to requests for water, blankets, and first aid. All of the cars of the Chieftain were literally smashed to splinters from the front to the back. They rammed into each other and were splintered into thousands of pieces. Luckily, the loaded cars were not as badly damaged as the unloaded cars. The momentum tore the trucks loose under several of the cars, and inertia caused them to lunge forward and pile up against the engine. The sight of the dreadful wreck, the mangled bodies, and the blood of the dead, with the piteous screams and sufferings of the wounded, were indescribable and were almost more than the witnesses could handle. Private Drury N. Matthews of Company A, the 50th Tennessee Infantry, was pinned between the tender and the engine by the thigh. Although many tried, they could not extricate him from the wreckage. He pleaded for his comrades to chop off his thigh, or to at least put him out of his misery, to relieve him of that burning agony. He screamed and pleaded for some 3 hours before he burned to death against the engine. One witness to the crash, who was a young girl at the time, described the scene. "We went to see what had happened and discovered that indeed two trains had collided in the deep cut. The engines were lying on their side, and the rail cars were shattered in the bottom of the cut. There were many injured people in the wreckage, and they were crying out for help, and particularly for water. We gathered buckets and pans and carried water up the road and down into the railroad cut. We learned from the survivors that the train coming from the north was loaded with wounded soldiers, and the train from the south carried soldiers that were headed into battle. Casualty reports from the crash vary regarding the number of killed and wounded from the collision. Witnesses could not determine who was injured as a result of the crash versus those previously wounded that were aboard the southbound train heading to the hospital. The dead were temporarily buried in a small cemetery near the crash site. 9 days later, the remains were removed and reinterred in the Confederate cemetery in Marietta, Georgia. Only a few random headstones were inscribed with brief inscriptions indicating the date of death from a train wreck. Estimates on how many bodies were transferred vary from 12 to 18. The history of the 50th Tennessee Infantry indicates that 13 men from a regiment were killed and 75 wounded. If these numbers are accurate, the additional 5 soldiers killed in the crash must have been on the other train. Regimental papers state that 13 men were killed in the crash and 75 more were wounded, but the newspaper articles give a different number. Captain Thomas E. Mallory of Company E was among the most dangerously wounded, but he managed to recover from his injuries. Captain Mallory survived the war and returned home to Robertson County, where he died in 1894. He is buried in the Adams City Cemetery in Adams. After the crash, the soldiers were placed on another train that was headed to Chattanooga, and they actually arrived the day before the Battle of Chickamauga. So they were all wore out from this train crash, plus having to get there and without having to get much rest, they went into battle the first thing the next morning. That may be why the death count was so high on the Confederate side at Chattanooga. But anyway, after the collision, both engines were repaired and put back into service. After the war, the chieftain and the senator, along with other rolling stock, were transferred by the state of Georgia to a lease contract. And 20 years later, after the lease, was transferred to the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis Railroad. The senator was rebuilt and put back into service in 1872. In 1874, the chieftain was rebuilt and put back into service. It had a different name of E.G. Cannabis. I wonder where they come up with that name at. Both of these historic wartime Dixie Flyers were later retired and sold for scrap iron to support World War I and World War II. Like I said, this was a true story, true account. Several sources were used to quote this. Like I said, it's featured in my book, A Ridge Too Far, about the life of Colonel Cyrus Sugg, who was also on that train in the train crash. Luckily, he didn't get wounded. He did go fight in the war in the Battle of Chickamauga. He was slightly wounded. He was mortally wounded at the next battle, Missionary Ridge, and he died in the hospital, refusing them to let him take his leg off. It set up gangrene, and he died from blood poisoning. So he's buried in Adams Cemetery. So I salute you, Colonel. But anyway, this has been the Dooster, Cryptids and Critters Paranormal. Invite you to subscribe to my page, like it, share it, and we will catch you on the flip-flop. Y'all have a good day.